Moving into a new home should be a fresh start, a moment of excitement, a new chapter filled with possibilities. That's exactly what I thought when I pulled into my driveway for the first time, staring at the charming two-story house I had worked my entire life to afford. The neighborhood was picturesque, almost too perfect. Manicured lawns, picket fences, and friendly faces that waved as I unpacked. It felt like stepping into a Norman Rockwell painting. Then came the first visit. A small, tight-lipped woman with a clipboard appeared on my doorstep as I was still unloading boxes. She introduced herself as Diana Holloway, the president of the Homeowners Association. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes, the kind that masked something colder underneath. "Welcome to the community. We like to keep things orderly here," she said, her voice polished but clipped, like she was reading off a script. "Just a few things to keep in mind. We have guidelines, strict ones. But as long as you follow them, you'll fit in just fine." I nodded politely, brushing off the slight discomfort settling in my gut. She handed me a thick packet: rules, regulations, fines for violations. At the time I didn't think much of it. After all, I had always been a good neighbor. I kept my lawn trimmed, my trash in the right bins, and my house in good repair. What could possibly go wrong? I was about to find out. The first month was smooth enough. I made small talk with neighbors, enjoyed my morning coffee on the porch, and settled into the rhythm of the community. But then the letters started coming. First, it was a warning about my front door color. "A shade too dark," Diana had written in the notice. It must align with the approved palette for the neighborhood aesthetic. It was brown. Just brown. Then, it was my mailbox height. Apparently it was half an inch too tall according to some obscure bylaw. Then my porch light too bright. Every week a new complaint, a new rule. It was almost as if they were making them up as they went along. And the worst part, the rules didn't seem to apply to everyone. The guy 2 doors down had a flamingo pink front door, and no one said a word. Another neighbor had garden gnomes scattered across his lawn, but somehow my single welcome mat was too distracting. That's when I started noticing the pattern. It wasn't about rules. It was about control. And Diana, she wasn't just running the HOA. She was ruling it. Diana wasn't just a stickler for the rules. She was a dictator in disguise. At first, it was easy to dismiss her as an overzealous perfectionist. Maybe she just really cared about the neighborhood. Maybe she just wanted things neat and orderly. But then I started hearing the whispers. One afternoon, while walking my dog, an elderly woman named Mrs. Caldwell stopped me. She had lived in the community for over 20 years, long before Diana took over. She looked around nervously before leaning in and whispering, "Be careful. If she has her eye on you, she won't stop." "What do you mean?" I asked, my stomach twisting. "She picks people, targets them. If she doesn't like you, she'll find a way to push you out." I wanted to laugh it off. It sounded ridiculous, like something out of a bad TV drama. But then I started piecing things together. The previous homeowners left suddenly. The house next to mine, empty for months after the owners were encouraged to move. More and more, I realized that Diana wasn't just enforcing rules. She was weeding out the people she didn't like. And she had made up her mind. I didn't belong. It didn't take long for Diana's actions to become more aggressive. At first, it was just more notices. My grass was half an inch too long, my garden hose wasn't properly coiled. Minor things that seemed laughable. But then she started stepping onto my property, inspecting things like she was some sort of self-appointed sheriff. One morning I caught her standing in my driveway, snapping pictures of my house. I stepped outside. "Can I help you?" She turned, completely unfazed, and smiled. "Oh, just documenting a few violations. You'll be receiving a notice shortly." Clenched my jaw. "For what this time?" He smirked. "You'll see." Sure enough, later that day, I received a $250 fine for failure to maintain community standards. No details, no specifics, just a demand for payment. I knew what this was. This wasn't about rules. This was a message. I was on her list now. And Diana, She wasn't just looking to make my life miserable. She was looking to force me out. I wish I could say I was surprised when the formal notice arrived, but by then I had come to expect it. What I didn't expect was the content. The letter was marked with the official HOA emblem, stamped like some government decree. But as I read the words, my blood ran cold. Your property does not align with the community's established guidelines and aesthetic values. Due to multiple infractions and ongoing disputes, the HOA has determined that your continued residence is no longer in the best interest of the community. And then the real kicker. You have 30 days to vacate the property or face legal action. I stared at the letter in disbelief. This was my home. I owned it outright. The idea that an HOA, some glorified neighborhood club, could tell me to leave was absurd. But then, at the very bottom, was the part that sent a chill down my spine. Failure to comply may result in foreclosure proceedings. Foreclosure. That wasn't just an empty threat. Chiz had pulled it off before, using a loophole, issuing ridiculous fines until a homeowner was financially crippled, then taking legal action to claim the house. My chest tightened as realization sank in. This wasn't just a game to Diana. This was her endgame. She wasn't just trying to make my life miserable. She was trying to steal my home. I stood there for what felt like hours, the letter trembling in my hands. The walls of my own home, once a symbol of hard work and security, now felt like they were closing in. How could this happen? How could a group of self-important neighbors, led by a woman drunk on power, have the audacity to try and take my home from me? I wasn't some reckless rule-breaker. I wasn't a threat to anyone. But to Diana, none of that mattered, because this wasn't about rules or community standards. It was about control. And she was determined to make an example out of me. But here's the thing about people like Diana. They always think they're untouchable. They build their little empires, convinced that no one will dare challenge them. They push and push, believing their victims will just crumble under the weight of the pressure. But what they never seem to understand is that some people like me, don't break. We push back. I wasn't going to let Diana intimidate me. Not in my own home. The next morning I poured myself a strong cup of coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and spread every letter, fine, and violation notice across the surface like pieces of a puzzle. If Diana thought she could just bully me into submission, she was in for a rude awakening. I was going to fight back, but I wasn't going to do it recklessly. I was going to be smart, calculated. I needed more than just righteous anger. I needed proof. So I started documenting everything. Every letter was scanned and saved. I took pictures of my violations. The mailbox that was supposedly too tall, the porch light that was apparently too bright, the grass that was allegedly too long. I even installed a security camera on my property, pointing it right at my driveway, just in case Diana decided to pay me another surprise visit. And then, something unexpected happened. While I was out walking my dog that afternoon, I noticed an older man, probably in his late 70s, standing by his front gate, watching me. His name was Mr. Blake, a quiet, retired schoolteacher who had lived in the neighborhood long before Diana ever stepped foot in it. I gave him a polite nod, but to my surprise, he beckoned me over. "You've got a target on your back," he said quietly, his voice rough with age. "I've seen it before." I blinked. "Excuse me." He glanced around, as if making sure no one was watching. "Diana. She does this. Picks someone, starts piling on the fines, the warnings. Anything to break you down. She wants you gone." My stomach twisted, but I kept my voice steady. "Why would she want me gone? I haven't done anything." Mr. Blake gave a bitter chuckle. "You think it's about what you've done. It's not. It's about what she can gain." And then he told me everything. Apparently, Diana had a pattern, a long-standing one. She would target certain homeowners, usually the ones who either stood up to her or simply didn't fit her vision of the perfect community. She'd bury them in fines, accuse them of endless violations, and when they were overwhelmed and exhausted, she'd push them to sell. But here's the kicker. Diana was working with a local realtor, someone she was friendly with. Once the homeowner caved and sold their property, the realtor would swoop in, buy the home below market value, and flip it for a profit. And guess who got a cut of the deal? Diana. I felt the blood drain from my face. It wasn't just about power, it was about money. She wasn't just a bully. She was running a scheme, using the HOA as a weapon to force people out of their homes for her own financial gain. That's when I realized this wasn't just a battle over petty fines. This was a war, fueled by a new wave of anger. Not just for myself, but for every person Diana had bullied out of their homes. I knew I needed to take this fight to the next level. Gathering my evidence was a start, but I needed a plan, a real one. So I did what Diana would never expect. I sought legal advice. The next day, I scheduled a meeting with a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes. I showed him everything: the letters, the photos, the security footage of Diana snooping around my property. His face darkened with every piece of evidence I presented. "This is classic HOA abuse of power," he said, shaking his head. "But the real smoking gun is the foreclosure threat. That's not just harassment. That's fraud if they're using bogus fines to push you out." He explained that while HOAs do have certain powers, they don't override state laws, especially when it comes to property ownership. Diana couldn't just bully me into foreclosure without a legitimate legal basis. And from the looks of it, she had none. Then he gave me the best piece of advice I could have hoped for. Start building a case. Collect everything. But don't confront her yet. Let her think you're still playing defense. It was brilliant. Diana thrived on control. She wanted me to feel helpless. But what she didn't realize was that I was now one step ahead. And then, the perfect opportunity came knocking, literally. A few days later, the HOA held a community meeting. It was one of those mandatory gatherings where Diana stood at the head of the clubhouse, barking out rule updates and reminders, while everyone else just sat there, afraid to speak. But this time, I was ready. As the meeting dragged on, Diana announced a new round of compliance inspections, thinly veiled threats for more fines. She shot me a smug glance, fully expecting me to sit there in silence like everyone else. But I didn't. I raised my hand. "Actually, Diana, I have a few questions." The room went silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Her smile tightened. "This isn't a Q&A session. If you have a concern, you can file a formal request." I didn't back down. "I just think the community deserves some transparency. Like, how exactly are these violations determined? Because I've noticed the rules seem to apply to some people more than others." A few heads in the crowd nodded, subtly but enough for me to notice. Diana's face flushed. "All violations are based on the HOA's established guidelines." I tilted my head. "Then why is my mailbox half an inch too tall a violation, but Mr. Callahan's bright pink front door isn't?" The murmurs grew louder. Diana's composure cracked, just a little, but enough for everyone to see. That's when I knew the tide was starting to turn. And this was just the beginning. The tension in the neighborhood was like a pot about to boil over. Diana may have still worn the crown of the HOA president, but the cracks in her reign were showing, and everyone was starting to see them. What used to be quiet compliance from the residents was now shifting into wary glances and whispered conversations. I could feel it, the subtle shift in the air. People were waking up. But Diana, she wasn't done yet. The very next morning, I opened my email to find a message from the HOA. The subject line hit me like a brick. Notice of illegal activity, unlawful retaliation against HOA. I almost laughed. Unlawful retaliation. According to the email, I was being formally accused of attempting to undermine HOA authority by spreading misinformation and disrupting community harmony. The letter threatened additional fines and legal action if I continued my defiance. It was so absurd that for a moment, I wondered if Diana had lost her mind. This wasn't just pettiness, it was desperation. She was scrambling for control, clutching at whatever threads of power she thought she had left. But here's the thing about desperation, it makes people reckless. I didn't respond. Instead, I forwarded the email straight to my lawyer. He called me within minutes. "She's panicking," he said. "This is a scare tactic, but it's good, really good, because now we have proof of harassment. She's overstepped her boundaries again." That's when he suggested the next move: filing a formal cease and desist order against Diana and the HOA for harassment and abuse of power. It was a bold step, but I was more than ready. By the end of the day, the legal paperwork was in motion. And then, something even more satisfying happened. Later that afternoon, there was a knock at my door. 2 police officers stood on my porch. For a split second, I felt a flicker of concern. Had Diana really gone that far? "Sir," one officer said, "we received a complaint from a member of your HOA about an unlawful eviction attempt. We just need to ask a few questions." I took a slow breath. So this was Diana's next move, dragging the police into her personal vendetta. But I was ready. "Of course, officers," I said calmly. "Please come in. I have something to show you." I pulled out every document. My property deed, Diana's violation notices, the most recent email accusing me of illegal activity. I even showed them the cease and desist letter my lawyer had just filed. One officer scanned the papers, his jaw tightening as he flipped through the files. Finally, he glanced at his partner and muttered, "This is completely legal. There's no eviction happening here." The other officer nodded and looked back at me. "Sir, it looks like this is a civil issue, not a criminal one. We'll have a word with the complainant." I couldn't help but smirk. "You mean Diana?" The officer didn't confirm or deny it, but the small twitch in his mouth said everything I needed to know. And just like that, they crossed the street and knocked on Diana's door. I couldn't hear the entire conversation, but I caught the end of it loud and clear. "Ma'am, this is a civil matter. Please don't call us again unless there's an actual emergency." The door shut. Diana had officially embarrassed herself, not just in front of me, but in front of the entire block. But the battle wasn't over. Not yet. The next day, I filed a formal legal notice with the court to move forward with a harassment claim against Diana and the HOA board. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about protecting the community from her abuse. I gave her 30 days to respond, but deep down I already knew she wouldn't go down quietly. The days ticked by, and the tension in the air grew thicker. I noticed fewer people nodding at Diana when they saw her. Conversations would stop when she walked past. The once tight grip she had over the community was slipping, fast. And then the final blow came. Eviction day. Not for me but for Diana. It turns out Diana had been so preoccupied trying to control everyone else that she had let her own financial matters slip through the cracks. The very realtor she had been conspiring with had dropped her, and with the lawsuit hanging over her head, she was crumbling. The sheriff's department arrived right on time. 2 officers stepped out of their patrol car with a clipboard, walking up to Diana's front door. She stood there, wild-eyed and furious, still refusing to believe this was happening to her. "Ma'am," one officer said, "we're here to execute a court-ordered eviction. You have 15 minutes to vacate the premises." Her voice cracked. "This is my home. You can't." The officer cut her off. "No, ma'am. This is not your home. According to court documents, you are trespassing on private property." I stood at a distance, watching as Diana's world crumbled. Her arrogance, her cruelty, it had all come back to bite her. In a final act of defiance, she knocked over a lamp inside her house, shoved a chair aside, and screamed something unintelligible. But it didn't matter. Because moments later, she walked out with a single suitcase, the rest of her belongings left behind, and got into her car. She looked at me one last time, her face red with humiliation, and then she drove off. The officers changed the locks, and I signed the final paperwork. It was over. The neighborhood was quiet again. No more fines, no more threats, no more constant fear of breaking some invisible rule. And then, the irony of it all hit me like a bolt of lightning. The very next day, I received an email from the HOA. "Due to a recent vacancy on the board, we would like to invite you to apply for the position." I laughed loud. Diana was gone, and now they wanted me, the person she tried to destroy, to take her place. I didn't even bother replying. I didn't need the title, because the sweetest victory of all was knowing that Diana had lost everything.